The concept of an afterlife, the very idea of what comes next, where are we going and why, what does it mean about why we're here in the first place, these are foundational elements to any religious belief system. And of course, today we're talking about Christianity and the evolution of the afterlife, biblically speaking, and it has changed quite a bit. In fact, it's even continuing to change. But if a perfect omniscient God wanted to communicate, supposedly like he did, the ideas about this afterlife from his own mouth, from the mouth of his son, and from the mouth of his foremost prophets, we should be able to expect that it would be consistent no matter who is saying it or how they have described it. But that's not what we see. We see different parts of the Bible written at different times with different cultural and political and religious motivations and pressures that represent this afterlife differently because of those things. If you can't be certain about your salvation, about where you go when you die, or when it happens, or how it happens, or what it's going to be like, what can you trust from this book? You can't then turn around and say, oh, but I know for certain that I'm saved and I can't lose my salvation. Oh, but I know for certain what objective morality is. Oh, but I know for certain what it means to love and worship and obey God. No, some things can be mysteries. Sometimes God's ways can be higher, but there's too much information said in this collection of books that we call the Bible about the afterlife to just let it off the hook for this obvious man-made change over time. And so how did we come to talk about this today? Really quick, I want to plug something brand new on the channel, the Patron Pick. For anyone that is in the free thinker tier, which is $10 and above per month on the Patreon, once a month you will go into a drawing if you have raised your hand to pick any topic that you want me to do a video on. So I put it out there to everyone in the category and above for the month of February, and I know people aren't used to me communicating on the Patreon, so please start checking that now. 17 of you raised your hand for February, and I did a random generator through Excel, and Becca Yoli won. Becca actually happens to have her own channel, Faith Exposed, which let's go give her some love. Check it out. Subscribe if it's going to be right for you. And she also has this great interview on Harmonic Atheist if you want to learn more about her. She gave me a handful of ideas to pick from, and one of them was the evolution of the afterlife, biblically speaking, and I was very excited to do it. So thank you, Becca. Thank you, everyone, for the support in any category, even if you're not a free thinker. It all matters, it all helps, and if you want to contribute, the link is down below. So what are we going to do for this video? We are going to go through that evolution. We're going to talk about Sheol. We're going to talk about a bodily resurrection, the introduction of judgment, the resurrection of the soul or eternal living of the soul, the concept of hell and its influences. We'll look at some subsets like Universalism or Annihilationism, and hopefully clearly show you why this people group, as it evolved in different places, in different cultures, in different situations, in different eras, added to, edited, changed, manipulated, retroactively refit, and evolved their afterlife belief system. So let's get started with the oldest idea from anything in this religion, which is the ancient Israelite idea of Sheol, a neutral underworld of the dead. It's a shadowy, somewhat mysterious existence where all people, regardless of their moral status before this God, will go. So this is unlike later Christian and even later Jewish ideas that still separate the dead into groups based off good or bad, forgiven or not. Sheol was indiscriminate. It was not a place of torture, nor was it a place of perfect pleasure or reward. It was just the realm of the dead. Maybe it was a place of passive existence. Maybe it was just the grave. Maybe it was no existence at all. I'm going to read you some different verses here, and you can get your own different ideas about it just from how you interpret it. So again, even our very first concept is up for debate. Sheol was very akin to the ancient Mesopotamian netherworld, Irkalla, where all souls resided in this dark and dusty domain without judgment. Let's go through some verses, starting right away, Genesis 37:35. All his sons and his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Jacob, believing that his son Joseph is dead, prepares to go down to him in Sheol. So we get the verbiage of down. And even though he says to be with him, it doesn't mean it's going to be an experience. He's just joining him where he is. This is Jacob. This is the birth of the nation of Israel, one of the top patriarchs. And this is his understanding, his assurance, what he knows to be true of what happens after death. If even your most righteous patriarchs expect to go down to Sheol, we have a lot of rethinking to do about our concept of heaven. Job 3:11-19, Why did I not perish at birth? For now I would be lying down in peace. The wicked cease from turmoil, and the weary are at rest. Prisoners are also at ease. The small and great are there, and the slave is freed from his master. So now we move on to our second great man of the Old Testament, also a very early figure, and he too believes in Sheol. This is when he's being tortured, and he says at least he would be at peace, which is, again, how many atheists kind of conceive of non-existence. Not that you are there to experience peace, but you're not there at all. There is no experience, and therefore there's at least not suffering. We also see there's no distinction between man. All are going here. This is a contradiction to the heaven and hell system. Ecclesiastes 9:10, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, to which you are going. This is the wisest man of all time, if you go with the biblical authorship here, Solomon, who believes that there's nothing, there's no consciousness when this all ends. And Job chirps back in Job 14:10 through 14, but a man dies and is laid low. Man breathes his last, and where is he? As water falls from a lake and a river wastes away and dries up, so a man lies down and rises not again. Till the heavens are no more, he will not awake or be roused out of his sleep. Oh, that you would hide me in Sheol, that you would conceal me, that you would appoint me a set time and remember me. This is Job asking for that afterlife that Christians believe in, but admitting that it is not so. This is the finality of Sheol. Psalm 6:5, the earlier part of the Psalms are thought to be attributed to David, for in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise? This is it. This earth, this time here, this is all we've got. David, Solomon, Job, and Jacob, they all understood this to be the case. Now, the Israelites did not develop their belief about the afterlife in isolation. They were, of course, like everything, heavily influenced by their neighbors, their culture, their time, their surroundings. And at this time, in the ancient Near East cultures, like the Mesopotamians, like the Canaanites, again, we mentioned Urkala, this is the Mesopotamian netherworld. Similar to Sheol, this is a neutral underworld. It's where the dead went, whether you were good or you were evil. They were in a weakened state, to say the least. They could not interact with the living, and there were gods that ruled over it, but there was no judgment. And then you had the Canaanite underworld, Mot's domain, where the god Mot ruled over the dead in a land where no one came back from. No concept of resurrection nor afterlife rewards. So the early Israelites, coming out of Mesopotamian and Canaanite cultures, naturally inherited this passive, neutral realm of the dead. And it wouldn't be until they got Greek and Roman and Persian ideas intermixed where their views would start to change. And there's plenty of excuses, and I'm not going to go through all of the objections and excuses because we still have a lot of evolution of afterlife to get through. But quickly, some Christians will claim that Sheol was the original plan, but there's a part 2, that this is just where everyone goes to sleep until Jesus resurrects them. But many of the verses I just read for you would defeat that. They do talk about the finality. There is no idea of a part 2. That concept does not exist. It was added in after the fact to excuse the evolved part of the religion. That's just very clear. Some will even argue that Sheol had its own 2 counterparts. We see this in Luke 16:22 through 23, where it talks about Abraham's bosom for the righteous, although we don't really have a negative one quite mapped out in the New Testament referring to Sheol because it's been moved to hell or Hades or Gehenna or Tartarus, which we'll get to. They'll bring in verses like 1 Peter 3:19 where Jesus goes to minister to the dead. But again, this is a New Testament belief that is trying to map back onto the old, and it's trying to make sense out of it. Well, if there's resurrection and new life in Jesus, and Jesus has been crucified and risen again for the people here, what about all the people that died in the flood? And that's what that verse actually references. Now, Jesus will go down to minister them, and they'll have their judgment, but that's a direct contradiction to the idea that everyone is just asleep. Did Jesus first wake them up to minister to them, then just to judge them? And again, we get all these New Testament claims trying to go backward, but even they are mutually exclusive with one another. Simply put, nowhere in the Old Testament does it suggest a 2-part Sheol, not once. The idea was imposed retroactively to try to harmonize what otherwise is not harmonized. So let's move into Second Temple Judaism, the post-exilic period. This is during or after the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE. And then that Second Temple period goes all the way to 70 CE with the destruction of that temple. So a pretty long runway to start making our move from death is final, no difference for the righteous or the wicked, to resurrection and judgment. Whatever could have happened during this time that made for such a change, that captivity, being around the Babylonians and the Persians. The belief in a bodily resurrection is insane when compared with what was just covered about the view of Sheol. And final judgment, distinct fates, we are really turning things over. So, first you have the influence of foreign powers. Persian, Hellenistic, that's where we get resurrection and cosmic judgment. Then you need to start introducing the problem of evil. These people, God's people who were supposedly protected and chosen, they've been in captivity, they've been enslaved, they've been oppressed. How do you account for this? How do you, more importantly, make up for this? Revenge, justice for themselves, judgment on their enemies, a place, a real place, a spiritual place of perfection, since it can't happen here on earth. We have motive now mixed with influence. Then you get into the Maccabean revolt, the idea of martyrdom, and you need compensation, you need reward. You need to know that your death in this movement is going to be seen, noticed, rewarded, and compensated. And then we see the Jewish thought clearly getting to this eschatological position, an end times framework, where resurrection plays a major role. Let me give you some verses here that back this up. So Isaiah 26:19, this is the very first hints of resurrection. Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. And we can see it's written in this post-exilic context where Israel is struggling to rebuild after the captivity in Babylon. It's this almost propaganda for the national pride of Israel to be restored, that the individual who makes up Israel can also be restored in death. Again, clearly contradicting with the earlier views of Job and Jacob, where the dead cannot return to life. So if that verse in Isaiah is our first hints, where's our first explicit idea of bodily resurrection? It's going to be in Daniel, which many are now thinking is written much later, which continues to make sense. And that's Daniel 12:2. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. This sounds pretty clear to me like an eternal reward or punishment system. Everlasting contempt. And also, many of those who sleep. So again, it's this meeting in the middle. Okay, Sheol existed. We see this in Isaiah as well. They're asleep, but something's going to happen. And we're starting to get different ideas about what's going to happen. But also, why just many? Why not all? Don't all who die either go to heaven or hell or annihilation or universal salvation? To say many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake means that some don't. This is another theological issue for the afterlife concept. Now, also, I typically try not to quote from apocryphal sources because we like to just stay in the Protestant 66 to make our case, because so many Christians who believe in just the Protestant canon will immediately reject anything outside of that anyways. But when you think about this time frame, the apocryphal writings, that's when they're happening. And so it makes sense to see what these Jewish people believed. And we can look at a few things. 2 Maccabees 7:9-14. You accursed wretch, you dismiss us from this present life, but the King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life because we have died for his laws. So we have resurrection and righteous judgment. In the Wisdom of Solomon 3:1-8, we get the souls of the righteous are in the hand of God, and no torment will ever touch them. In the eyes of the foolish, they seem to have died, but they are at peace. So again, not quite clear. We know there's not going to be punished, but we also know they're going to be with God. So we have a lot of things happening here. Again, you can almost feel the ironing out of ideas and the ways to try to reconcile them still with the obvious Jewish thought that came before. That's why we have to keep referencing that something's happening to those that were asleep. We're driving it forward. We're evolving. So again, to understand a few of these influences, one would be the Persian influence. After the Babylonian exile, the Israelite people came under the Persian rule. The main religion of the Persians at this time, Zoroastrianism, contained clear belief in resurrection, final judgment, and reward or punishment. No one else thinks that it is just too coincidental that this group of people, at the exact same time they are being ruled by this new group of people, leave the ideas from their past that look like the others in that past, culture, time, and place, like the Mesopotamians and the Canaanites, and start adopting something new that looks identical to their captors. It doesn't take a genius. I think it's all too clear. So, the Persian influence. Next, again, the Maccabean revolt. This happens between 167 and 160 BCE, and now we have a need for justice. The Greek king here is persecuting the Jews. They have desecrated the temple and forced them to essentially abandon the religion, the faith. Many Jews at this time are tortured and executed for not following Greek rule. And so very quickly, even though they should have been thinking about this for all their enemies the whole time in their history, they start to have to grapple with, wait a second, what is this all for? We're not ruling here anymore like we were. What happened to the promised land? Things aren't easy. Where's the milk and honey? Where's the prosperity? Where's us being the leaders of our world? Did we lose? We can't lose. Oh, there must be something coming next. There must be a bigger reward, something we were thinking so small, so human. The real world is the next world, and we will be rewarded there and our enemies crushed. It's a cope, which, by the way, all afterlife systems are essentially a cope, a god of the gaps for the unknown that we're so uncomfortable with. What happens when we die? Why were we here at all? What was our meaning when we were here? What happens when it's over? Will we be rewarded? If we suffered here, will we be compensated? And will those who made us suffer get theirs too? It's what all of it's answering, just in different ways and at different times. And thankfully, the Israelites, the Jewish people, help us get through quite a few of them. Then you get the Hellenistic influence as probably the third thing here with what is causing the change, and this is the concept of the immortal soul. Under this Greek rule, many Jews were exposed to this philosophical concept, this Platonic philosophy, the immortality of the soul rather than just a bodily resurrection, which is what we had been previously talking about. I want to make sure I made that distinction. The Greeks say the soul is naturally immortal and goes to a realm of bliss or punishment based off its encounters here on earth. This is not the idea before their influence, and it becomes the idea after their influence. And by the way, it's not like us thousands of years later said, wait a second, this doesn't all work together. This is why you even had the division in the first place between, say, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees believed in resurrection. The Sadducees didn't. They rejected that. We see that in both Mark and Acts. But they had good reason to. They were just reading a different part of the Bible without making the excuses. I think we can oftentimes, we're told this from apologetics, that things were so easy, that Christianity looked one way for a long time until those Protestants screwed it up, till that Reformation brought in all these new ideas into tension. And that's not true. There has been disagreement and infighting and splits all the way through. But just like now, everyone thought they were right. They were the one exception. They had it correct. They heard from God. They had their revelation. They had their patriarch. They had their verse. An all-you-can-eat buffet, a design your own afterlife. So we have all of our big building blocks now, but it's time to start defining things. Moving into the Hellenistic period itself and the time with Jesus, let's really nail down these thoughts on eternal punishment. It did not exist in early Jewish thought, that's clear. And this development of hell took literal centuries to happen, and it was shaped by a mix of internal theological evolution, foreign cultural influences, and the political climate of the time. So where did the idea of hell come from, this fiery, tormenting, and eternal hell of Christianity? This could be its own 15-hour video. People have written books about this concept. I'm going to give you just a few things. Let's start with four main influences that help develop this idea. Again, still the Persian influence, the Zoroastrianism. That introduces an idea of final judgment and division between eternal reward or punishment. Then you get the Greek thought, who had Hades and Tartarus, two terms we see used in the New Testament. This added the notion of consciousness to this afterlife torment, where the soul itself suffers based off the morality of the individual. But then we also have the Jewish people doing their own thing. They are now under their own mix of influences, creating this apocalypticism. It's a hard word to say. Here, hell didn't just help us understand what would happen to us as a fear tactic. It gave us a sense of relief of what would happen to our enemies because of what they did. It becomes a divine justice system. And then you get Jesus and early Christianity as our fourth one, where Gehenna and Hades and the lake of fire are accepted. This is the new punishment imagery, shifting towards, again, a moralized afterlife. And I'll give you some examples. Again, going back to Isaiah, where we're getting the first glimpses of some of these changes, this is where we get a fiery fate entering the picture. Isaiah 66:24, their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. Now, this passage is actually describing corpses being burned outside of Jerusalem, not conscious souls being tormented. But in Mark 9:48, Jesus refers to this verse to illustrate and give example of the hell he is speaking about. Then you have Gehenna, which is Greek for the Valley of Hinnom, and originally was a real place outside of Jerusalem. If you go back to the Old Testament in 2 Kings, this is the place where those who worshipped Moloch would do child sacrifices. But in Jesus' time, it was kind of the town trash dump where you would burn what you didn't need. And the imagery became a metaphor for divine justice. Now, this is where many people disagree, especially if you're talking to someone who believes in annihilationism or universal salvation. They'll say, you don't understand. Hell's not this real everlasting conscious torment place. Jesus was just talking about how the bad things would be burned up. The end would be, and you can apply this to anything, the fact that there will be a new heaven and earth, and therefore all the old will go away, or a purification. Some people will bring this into limbo or purgatory. Some people will talk about a short stint of hell where you're purified before universal salvation. Others will say you have to be purified before you are annihilated, and others will say, no, this is imagery, it is metaphorical, but it is about an eternal conscious torment. If only there was a promised Holy Spirit who would give wisdom whenever it was asked for and would lead people in the truth and in spirit and in power, it would probably clear all this up, and yet we don't have it. You can poll 1,000 different Christians on the afterlife and get almost as many different ideas. But to read the verses here, Matthew 5:22, whoever says, you fool, be liable to the hell of fire. The Greek word being used there, Gehenna. So Jesus is using it to symbolize divine punishment, but that's not in the Old Testament. Matthew 10:28, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. We'll talk about this verse again later during Annihilation, but here Jesus is linking it to destruction, not eternal torment. In Mark 9:47-48, it is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hell, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Now again, this is Jesus quoting back to Isaiah, and incorrectly, unless it's just a huge leap in metaphor, because we know what it was trying to be alluded to in Isaiah. But here we have 2 insights into non-death. Non-destruction. The worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Okay, yeah, but maybe humans do. Maybe it's just a place filled with worms and fire. Don't know. Unclear. But Gehenna is not always the word used. Sometimes it's Hades. Like in Luke 16:19-31, this is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. A rich man suffers in Hades while a poor man, Lazarus, is in Abraham's bosom. Again, trying to retroactively make Sheol, the place where you're asleep with your fathers, into some at least positive reward system, but also showing that there's a negative one and that someone is there and they are there for a while at least, and they are actively suffering. Hades, by the way, being a Greek concept originally from Homer's Odyssey, where souls existed after death in a ghostly state. Interesting enough, in the Greek Septuagint, translation of the Old Testament, Hades replaces the word Sheol, again showing that major Greek influence on Jewish thought. You can see the evolution in the words that are used in translation. In Revelation 20:14, then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire, meaning Hades itself can be destroyed. And that contradicts the idea of eternal hell. So if Hades is temporary, then why do modern Christians even teach about hell? And then there's also the lake of fire, and this is a lot of things that get mixed up and confused. And again, some people will claim, oh no, we have the understanding for it on both sides, right? They'll read a book by Bart Ehrman and they'll be like, no, I totally understand. I know exactly what it means. I know exactly what the afterlife is, while still maintaining their belief in Jesus and his resurrection and salvation. While someone else who doesn't believe in this God at all can still read the Bible and come away with an idea about universalism under that doctrine, or even the concept of conscious eternal torment. You really can get all ideas out of the Bible. You can argue about them. You can say, well, you know yours is right, but you can't deny that many Christians throughout much of history have believed mutually exclusive things about what happens when they die. That's a problem. It's one of the things I'm trying to point out here. For the lake of fire, we have the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophets were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Problem is, a lot of people are called false prophets under a lot of different conditions throughout both the Old and New Testament. And then you could even make a case that all the people who ever claimed to believe and then didn't because their works didn't match up, or again, all the different ways you take it are actually false prophets. And then you could say all non-believers are technically false prophets, and you can get into this whole, okay, even though it's classification for who gets eternal conscious torment, we can broaden that categorization to include the people we don't like or the people we're trying to convert or whatever the case may be. I'm not here to tell you what I think is doctrinally accurate. I don't even know if there is such a thing. This is not univocal by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just here to show all the different iterances of it, because again, I think it'll help you see how man-made it all is. Revelation 21:8, but the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and the liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. Now, second death implies annihilation, but a burning lake of sulfur sure sounds like the burning lake of fire that was just referenced, where there is eternal conscious torment. Again, you can make both cases off of this verse here. So hell is changing one way or another, and it's because of the Greek influence mainly. Hades, Tartarus, immortal souls, all of these things. You still have the Zoroastrian element of fiery final justice. You still have the Roman oppression that leads to the Jewish apocalypticism. We see that, for instance, with another apocryphal work like the Book of Enoch that describes fire and punishment and demons and hell. And also, Christian theology here needed a moral system. Post-mortem justice became necessary. And so the New Testament heaven and hell framework evolved. The wicked needed punished and the righteous needed reward. And in whatever form you accept it, all of that is different than the original concept of Sheol. You cannot tell me there's not an evolution to the afterlife concept in the biblical text. There is. And then quickly here you have the rise of both Annihilationism and Universalism, which I've already mentioned more on the way through than I thought I was going to. So quickly, let's cover this. Annihilationism is the concept that the wicked are ultimately destroyed, that they are not eternally tormented. Even this camp is broken in two, with if they're destroyed immediately upon death, or if they still need to go through some refinement or punishment system before they can be annihilated. Universalism is probably the simplest of all of these options, and it's just the belief that everyone goes to heaven. But again, do they go to heaven right away when they die? Do they go to heaven after the final judgment? What's the point of a final judgment if everyone goes to heaven? Oh, because maybe even under universalism, you have to be refined or purified first before you can go. Again, these people cannot agree on what they believe even under this alternate explanation. Do you see how messy and ridiculous all of this is yet? But where do we get these ideas? Quickly, I'll read to you some verses. Again, going back to Matthew 10:28, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul, rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Okay, God is going to be able to destroy both the body and the soul, the two things that at different times have both thought to not be eternal in any way or to not be rewarded in any way, but here both can be destroyed. And in the next one, both can be accepted, or at least one, the soul. There's still some question even amongst people that straight up believe in heaven, which is one part of this we haven't even really talked about yet, with if it is a new body, which is described in the Bible, or if you just exist kind of in soul form. It says there will be recognition, but to what degree? Then we get into all the problems with heaven, which I've talked about enough. Also, 2 Peter 2:6 gives an idea. By turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. Okay, so if extinction is the example, then extinction is the answer, and extinction sounds more like annihilationism than our typical concept of hell. Many will reach back into the Old Testament to Malachi 4:1-3, for behold, the day is coming, burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and evildoers will be stubble. The day is coming that shall set them ablaze, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. Sounds like complete destruction. Also out of context a wee bit, and not compatible with the idea of eternal torment, nor the idea of Sheol. Psalm 37:20 says, but the wicked will perish. The enemies of the Lord are like the glory of the pastures. They vanish like smoke. They vanish away. Again, it gets weird when you reach into the Old Testament to make your case for annihilation, because a lot of this just sounds like physical retribution for the people that go against God being burned up or destroyed, and nothing to do with their after body or their soul. But it's a good reinforcement for what they're trying to milk out of the New Testament already. Then Revelation 21:8, the second death, which sounds like a final death. Again, annihilation. So where do people get verses for universalism? And again, not that we can agree on what fashion universalism takes on, but Colossians 1:19-20 says, "For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross." I mean, that's a pretty good verse to make you believe in universalism. The problem is that it is in direct contradiction with everything else we've covered. With Sheol, with hell, with annihilationism. You can't have any of that if you have this. 1 Corinthians 15:22 says, "For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive." That sounds like resurrection for everybody. It doesn't necessarily guarantee a happy resurrection, but the connotation is with life, which is being opposed here to death. So there's that. In 1 Timothy 2:3-4, we get, "This is good, and it is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth." That's a really stretch of a verse there. I love this verse in terms of making the case that this Bible, if this God were true, proves that he already lost. If he desires for all to be saved, if that's his will, and he's all powerful, and even one person has been annihilated or is in Sheol, or worse, is burning in hell, then this God did not get his will. And yet he's perfect, and he works for his will to be done. And he says he will answer prayers that are prayed for his will to be done. So there's just no excuse here for his purposeful deception or hardening of hearts, or the very fact that he would create hell or annihilation or anything like this. It just doesn't all work together. And funny, because this next verse is loved and used by all three main groups, and that is Philippians 2:10-11. "At the name of Jesus, every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth, under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord." The universalist will say, see, everyone will come, everyone will know, and then everyone will believe. They'll go to heaven. The one who believes in annihilation will say, yep, the time will come, but if I add in my other verses, all this proves is that they confess before they're disposed of. And those who believe in hell will say, yep, look, final judgment comes, and even those who didn't believe, you're going to have to face Jesus. You're going to have that moment before he sends you to hell where you are forced to acknowledge that you were wrong. They put it in my comments often. I assure you, people who believe in hell use this verse. They love painting pictures for this moment for me because they want me to get mine. They want me to have that moment where I am wrong and I know it. What love, what peace, what justice. And by the way, each of these developed for their own obvious reasons. Some people couldn't reconcile the idea of Sheol with heaven and hell, so creating annihilationism matches up pretty well. Some people couldn't reconcile or justify endless punishment, eternal conscious torment, and so annihilation fits well for that. Or universalism, because if there really is a good God who desires all should be with him, then all need to be with him. So we'll just say they are. We could go on about the lake of fire, and we could go on about the new heaven and the new earth, but I do think you get the point I'm trying to make in this video, and I feel like I've already gone on pretty long here. So let's do a quick wrap up here, kind of a closeout. To me, with everything I've listed and so much that I didn't, it is clear to me that there is an unmistakable evolution of the afterlife concept throughout even just the Protestant canon, let alone when you add in any of the other books. Sheol is the original Hebrew view. The Persian influence gives us resurrection and judgment. The Hellenistic influence gives us Gehenna and Hades and the immortal soul. Christian hell then comes along. It cannot be agreed upon. It exists in different fashions with different groups going to different places based off different things, but also different definitions about who is contained within those groups. And we get arguments about the lake of fire versus purgatory versus being annihilated versus maybe everyone being saved. So why would an omniscient God change his mind on the idea of the afterlife? How was this not put forward from the beginning? God decides to make man in his own image with the foreknowledge that it would go wrong, that the first man ever created and the first woman ever created would both sin almost as soon as they possibly could, and that he would choose to curse everybody else that would ever exist with the same punishment, death. But what happens after you die? Did God not think it through? Did God have a different plan for some people than others? We hear this context thing all the time that, law back then for the Jewish people was different than law for us today, New Covenant, things of that nature. Is it not the same? Maybe Sheol is just for the ancient Jews. Except some of those verses talk about all men, what everyone will face. Well, all must just not mean all. Or, well, it does until Jesus comes. But then Jesus is going to change things, and we're kind of back on with the New Covenant cliche. We're talking about, again, a foundational element and principle of religion, though. It changing makes no sense at all. It being dependent makes no sense at all. And even if you could draw Sheol into some new theology that is different just for people after Jesus, which is it? Hell, universalism, or being annihilated? And then if you can agree, which you cannot, on which of those three, agree on what those three look like. What is hell? How do you go there? Who keeps you there? How long is it? Is it physical or is it mental? Do we have a body or just a soul? How do you torture a soul? If it's annihilation, do you go there right away? After judgment? After being purified? What's the point of purifying you before he annihilates you? If it's universalism, is it really universalism? Is it really for everybody? Or will some still be asleep, like referenced in one of our first verses? Do some have to be burned and refined first? For how long? Who determines that? Who's judging it? Where is it? Where are you taken to next? Where is this heaven? All the problems with heaven. And again, if it's really hell, is it metaphorically hell? And again, we could just go on and on and on. I'm going to end just by asking questions. Here's some questions I want you to think about. Why does God remain completely silent in the entire Torah about the concept of heaven and hell, which would dominate the New Testament? Why did God allow the idea of Sheol to be the prominent and only idea for over 1,000 years about the afterlife? Why did God allow influence from other cultures who worshipped false and fake gods to influence the afterlife system that would be claimed to him in the future of this religion? Why does Jesus himself define and describe hell in contradicting terms? And if you tell me that he didn't, he was clear on it, then why do most Christians disagree on the concept of hell? That's really it for today. Thank you again, Becca, for the suggestion. I hope that everyone who is a free thinker or higher will raise their hand for the March video. I'll be excited to see whatever one of you has in store for me. I'll see you Tuesday with another takedown, and until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Alexander, Ann, Boris, Eric, GVI, Joe, Kiboga, Matthew, Perry, and Sean; my Humanist heroes, James, Jared, Christy, and Thronus; my Atheist advocates, Caleb, David, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Julie, Malcolm, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas; as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.